Good evening, everyone. My name is Cormac Moore. I'm one of the historians in residence with Dublin City Council, and I started doing this Ireland in 1920, 21, 22. In 2020, it was very different, of course, back then. With everything was going through Zoom. This is the first time I'm doing this series in person, but we're also live streaming as well, as you probably would have gathered by the message. So, over the next 5 weeks, I'll be conducting lectures here in Pearse Street Library, which will also be live streamed for those who can't attend in person, looking back at key moments from a pivotal year in modern Irish history, 1923. Today's lecture will provide an overview of what will be covered in the coming weeks. And from next week, I will delve deeper into specific topics. That's going to share my screen here now. Hope you all can see. So the areas I will cover are, from next week, the Civil War in 1923, the final 6 months, 100 years of the land border in Ireland, the 1923 Republican hunger strike, and gaining international recognition, joining the League of Nations. With the Irish Free State officially only a month old at the start of 1923, it faced enormous challenges as a state trying to gain its feet as an independent nation. And here is an image from the Sphere from January 1923, showing key Free State government members of the Free State with the title A New Ireland. And it includes the President, W.T. Cosgrave, Ernest Bligh, Kevin O'Higgins, Patrick Hogan, Richard Mulcahy, Desmond Fitzgerald, and J.J. Walsh. The most obvious challenge faced by the Free State government was the ongoing civil war, as Republicans refused to recognise the legitimacy of the Free State. By January 1923, Republicans had little hope of winning the conflict, but continued on regardless, adopting guerrilla tactics which had proved successful against the British during the War of Independence. In military terms, the prospects for the Free State government had improved greatly by January 1923. There was less Republican activity, key leaders had been arrested, and the anti-treaty IRA was incapable of launching any major offensive, with attacks generally confined to remote areas. A Free State military report of 21st of January 1923 commented on the Republicans, with depleted numbers, lack of resources and unified control, and almost complete ineffectiveness. From a military standpoint, their policy of militant action is slowly changing to one of sheer destructiveness and obstruction of the civil government. The first months of 1923 saw a continuation of the anti-treaty IRA's campaign to cripple the Free State economically at its birth through the destruction of communication, travel, and infrastructure networks. Throughout the 26 counties, there was widespread burning, bombing, and damage of railway lines, trains, roads, bridges, buildings, including houses of those considered enemies of the Republic, either pro-treatyites or those perceived to have remained loyal to the Crown. Here's a derailed train between Dundalk in Louth and Inniskeen in Monaghan in January 1923, one of over 40 overturned trains by the anti-treaty IRA since the Civil War had started. And this is an image of a passenger train on fire near Killiney Station in Dublin in February 1923. Here's an illustration of Free State soldiers watching on as a train tries to cross a collapsed bridge in County Tipperary. And pictured is the mansion of the Earl of Mayo, Palmerstown House in County Kildare, in ruins. It's a very grainy image of what it looked like beforehand, but you can see it's pretty much intact. These tactics and the continuation of the war were deeply frustrating for the Free State government, who led its supporters to believe, through its propaganda campaign in July 1922, that the war would be shortly over. In January 1923, members of the Free State Cabinet were asked by the President of the Executive Council, W.T. Cosgrave, to provide memoranda on the best course to take with conflict. Kevin O'Higgins, Vice President of the Executive Council and Minister for Justice, argued that they were faced with an opposition which had a vested interest in law breaking and social dislocation. O'Higgins and the Minister for Agriculture and Lands, Patrick Hogan, believed large sections of the population were losing sympathy with the Free State Army and government. Hogan told the Dáil that we are prepared to take rough and ready measures. He wrote in his memorandum to the Executive Council that the irregulars must be beaten and terrorised by the utmost military activity. O'Higgins argued that there should be executions in every county, as the news of capital charges in Dublin was having little effect in the provinces. There were more executions in the month of January 1923 than there had been since the Free State started on its policy of executing Republicans in November 1922, right up to the end of the conflict in May 1923. Out of a total of 83 executed during the conflict, 34 were executed alone in January 1923. While O'Higgins' wish of spreading out these executions to every county was not met, the geographic spread of executions was considerable. This can be seen from this map taken from the Atlas of Irish Revolution, with Republicans executed outside of Dublin in places such as Donegal, Louth, Westmeath, Kildare, Laois, Carlow, Offaly, Kilkenny, Wexford, Waterford, Cork, Kerry, Tipperary, Limerick, Clare and Galway. Republicans targeted the homes of government members and supporters, TDs and senators. W.T. Cosgrave's home near Rathfarnham was destroyed in January 1923. Here is Cosgrave, closely guarded by staff armed with rifles and revolvers, assessing the ruins of his home. The following month, Cosgrave's government colleague, O'Higgins, experienced a far greater tragedy. O'Higgins' homestead Woodlands in Strably in County Laois was attacked in November 1922, with the raiders unsuccessfully trying to burn the house. Another attack on the house took place in February 1923, with far more deadlier consequences. On Sunday, 11th of February, the raiders returned, determined on burning the house again. According to the Irish Times, the raiders appear to have arrived in a motor lorry. At first, Kevin O'Higgins' father, Dr. Thomas F., refused to admit them, but they succeeded in getting in after time in order that they might read a document in Dr. Higgins' possession. Dr. Higgins handed a document to one of the men, and it is said that while he was looking at it, the doctor snatched his revolver. The man rushed into the hall and told two of his companions who was there to fire. They did so, and Dr. Higgins was killed instantly. On top of the executions, extrajudicial killings took place too. According to Sean Enright, a further 125 prisoners were killed in the custody of the Free State, shot at the point of capture or killed in custody. The most notorious of these occurred in Kerry, all mainly within days of each other in March 1923, in what became known as Kerry's Terror Month. After 5 Free State soldiers were killed by a planted landmine in Knocknagoshel after being lured into a trap to investigate arms on 6th of March, the next day, in a clear act of reprisal, 9 Republican prisoners were taken from Tralee Barracks to nearby Ballyseedy, were tied at the wrists and shoelaces, and a landmine was detonated, killing 8 of the 9. To make sure all were dead, Free State soldiers subsequently shot the dismembered bodies. Remarkably, one of the 9, Stephen Fuller, was blown by the blast of the mine into an adjoining field and escaped, and made a full recovery from his injuries, physically at least. He later became a Fianna Fáil TD. And here is Fuller on the right, canvassing in the late 1930s. Less than 24 hours later, 5 more Republican prisoners were taken to Countess Bridge near Killarney, where 4 more were killed when a mine exploded. As with Ballyseedy, there was a survivor to tell the tale, Ty Coffey. And on 12th of March, another 5 Republican prisoners were blown up near Cahersabeen. To make sure no one escaped on that occasion, all 5 prisoners were shot in the legs beforehand. While the worst atrocities occurred in Kerry, extrajudicial killings also take place in Dublin and Wexford. The executions of 4 anti-treaty IRA members in Drumbow and Donegal, also in March, were particularly controversial, executed in retaliation for the death of someone they had nothing to do with, reminiscent of the executions of Rory O'Connor, Liam Mellows, Dick Barrett and Joe McKelvey in December 1922, following the killing of Sean Hales while they were in prison. Republicans were hoping that the ruthlessness of the government would see public opinion swing towards them. British ruthlessness, after all, had seen such a swing previously. It was believed that if the government was provoked to commit acts of brutality, the public would switch from Treatyites to the Republicans. There wasn't a swing though, there was mainly war weariness. People wanted peace above all else. The lack of support for the Republicans, the refusal of people to move towards them, brought a change in mind among some Republicans for a war they could never win. The military outlook and the executions policy of the Free State government also took its toll on the morale within the Republican movement, particularly for those imprisoned. According to Michael Hopkinson, the Free State policy of suspending death sentences on condition that hostilities ended in the localities of the sentenced men placed intolerable strains on Republicans, both inside and outside jail. According to Eamon de Valera, the biggest blow since we started came after the arrest of Liam Deasy, Deputy Chief of Staff of the anti-treaty IRA, on the 18th of January. To avoid execution, Deasy agreed to a prepared statement calling for an end to the war. Other prisoners followed suit in Cork and Limerick jails, believing that continuing the war was hopeless. While many Republicans did not heed Deasy's instructions to end the war at the time, it had a devastating effect on morale within the Republican camp. The neutral IRA, consisting of IRA members like Florrie O'Donoghue, who had fought in the War of Independence but did not do so during the Civil War, persisted in its efforts to bring about a truce, as did the Vatican through Pope Pius XI, sanctioning the departure of Monsignor Salvatore Lucio, seen here in the centre, which was not well received by the Catholic hierarchy in Ireland, nor the Free State government. The Dublin correspondent for the British newspaper, The Morning Post, wrote that it was wild women who drove Republicans' resistance and were responsible for prolonging the war. Women inspire, organise, plan, recruit, carry messages and weapons, spy, steal, deliver threatening notices, distribute the Republican bulletin, and perform all the essential tasks without which Liam Lynch and his acolytes will be as helpless as babies in a bath. The Morning Post correspondent contended that your Hibernian male is a poor fish without a tenth of the gumption possessed by his sisters, his female cousins, and his aunts. Female Republicans generated some of the most heated rhetoric and ferocious responses during the Civil War. Dubbed the Furies by P.S. O'Hegarty in 1924, the attacks on Republican women displayed a barely concealed misogyny. Free State Cabinet Minister J.J. Walsh called them the women in men's clothing. Kevin O'Higgins referred to hysterical young women who ought to be paying five-fingered exercises or helping their mothers with the brasses. While the Catholic bishops decried decent Irish boys who had degenerated by taking up arms against the new state, the women who rejected that state were frequently dehumanized. Dan Breen admitted that Republicans would have to kill 3 out of every 5 people to win the war. It wasn't worth fighting on. Peace became more likely when prominent Republicans, such as Austin Stack and Ernie O'Malley, were captured. Although he was President of the Republic, as a peripheral figure militarily, de Valera's call for an end to hostilities had little impact on the anti-treaty IRA Chief of Staff, Liam Lynch, who, as the war dragged on during the spring of 1923, remained the biggest obstacle to it ending. While most other Republican leaders were downbeat and resigned to defeat, Lynch remained overly optimistic, believing that mountain artillery, expected from Germany and the US, would save the day. He also had a bizarre reading of the military situation in the west of Ireland, believing it was putting up a strong fight, when in reality, Republicans in places like Mayo and Sligo were hardly putting up a fight at all by that stage. Crucially, when he was mortally wounded in the Knockmeal Down Mountains on 10th of April 1923, dying that same day, the appetite to continue the war was at an end. Here is a memorial to Lynch close to the site where he was mortally wounded. Lynch's replacement as Chief of Staff, Frank Aiken, was elected unopposed, even though he was a reluctant opponent of the Free State at the start of the Civil War. While Republicans were looking for a way to end the war in which their honour and ideals remained intact, negotiations with the Free State government proved fruitless. The government was aware of the dire military outlook for the anti-treaty side and was in no mood to compromise. Instead of surrendering, the anti-treaty IRA called an end to the war by ordering its members to dump their arms. In a letter to members on 24th of May 1923, Frank Aiken wrote, "Comrades, the arms with which we have fought the enemies of our country are to be dumped. The foreign and domestic enemies of the Republic have for the moment prevailed. De Valera sent a message on the same day to the soldiers of liberty, legions of the rear guard, writing, "The Republic can no longer be defended successfully by your arms. Further sacrifices on your part would now be vain and continuance of the struggle in arms unwise in the national interest. Military victory must be allowed to rest for the moment with those who have destroyed the Republic. Other means must be sought to safeguard the nation's right." This is considered a moment when the Civil War hostilities came to an end. Kevin O'Higgins warned in the Dáil in June, though, there is going to be a pretty ugly aftermath to this whole business. Violence continued beyond May, including extrajudicial killings by Free State forces, which went unpunished, most notoriously that of Noel Lamass, brother of future Taoiseach Sean, whose mutilated body was found in the Dublin Mountains in October 1923. Here's a memorial to Noel Lamass in the Dublin Mountains. Arrests of Republicans continued after May. Senior Republican military figures, Liam Pilkington and Humphrey Murphy, were arrested, as was De Valera in August 1923, as he was about to address an election rally in Ennis in County Clare. He was whisked away to Arbour Hill. Here's a great picture, actually, an illustration from the Illustrated London News showing the stormy petrel of Ireland caged at last. De Valera's arrest. Even though most of the public opposed the Republican campaign during the Civil War, there was much revulsion at some of the tactics adopted by the Free State government during the conflict. Many voted for Republicans in the August 1923 general election, who performed far better than many had expected beforehand, winning 44 seats and 286,000 votes. Here are the sons of De Valera and the by then executed Erskine Childers addressing an election rally on O'Connell Street in Dublin. Republicans did particularly well in places like Kerry and Sligo, where Free State measures were considered the most extreme, demonstrating a bitterness towards Free State tactics that prevailed. Republicans did less well in urban locations and areas less affected by the Civil War. They only won 17% of the vote in Dublin. The pro-treaty faction of Sinn Féin had been rebranded as Cumann na Gael earlier in 1923. It won 63 seats and 415,000 votes. While the election showed to Republicans that there was an electoral and constitutional path available to them, it also legitimised the Free State's existence. There could be no accusations of British threats of it being an unfair and unfree election, as there had been in June 1922. Here you can see Gardaí seen protecting ballot boxes in a jaunting car. Many of the Republican candidates were still incarcerated. As there was no negotiated settlement, with Republicans dumping arms to fight another day, instead of surrendering them, there was no large-scale prison releases, with 12,000 people still imprisoned or interned after the war had ended, including 500 women. Here are Republican prisoners in Tralee Jail in July 1922. The Free State government chose to release the prisoners and internees in stages, according to the danger they felt they posed. The government also had to deal with what was described as passive irregularism, such as seizure of land and stocks. Relinquishing none of its hardline stance, the government introduced a new public order bill in June 1923, granting powers to intern and introducing flogging for arson and robbery. The use of flogging, the most criticised element of the draconian Special Powers Acts brought into Northern Ireland in 1922, including criticism by the Free State leaders at the time, came in for particularly harsh condemnation. The biggest problem for the Free State authorities and the Republican leadership was the continued retention of the 12,000 Republicans in jail beyond the ceasefire. Unsure of when release dates would come from what were considered very poor conditions in the prisons and camps around the country, and disillusionment with the Republican leadership, morale amongst the prisoners and internees was at an extremely low ebb. There were also regional tensions in the prisons, with one internee, John Cullinan, from Dublin No. 1 Brigade, referring to Corkmen who would only obey their own officers. It was also very hard to impose discipline within prisons, as internees were regularly moved around to different prisons or camps around the country. There were also undue pressure on internees to sign the form and accept the legitimacy of the Free State. Without any coordinated plan within the Republican movement, prisoners in Mountjoy took the initiative themselves and went on hunger strike on 13th of October 1923 as a protest against prison conditions and the continuation of their internment. And here are prisoners in Mountjoy in 1920. Now, this is an earlier period during the War of Independence. Hunger strikes had been a potent weapon during that conflict through either forcing the British to back down or as a powerful means of propaganda if hunger strikers were to pay the ultimate sacrifice, as was the case with Terence MacSwiney in October 1920, which garnered huge international attention and support for the independence struggle. Female internees, such as Terence's sister, Mary, had gone on hunger strike during the Civil War, forcing the Free State government to release them to avoid adverse publicity. And here is Mary MacSwiney's sister, Annie, conducting a hunger strike outside Mountjoy jail in protest against the treatment of her sister. The prisoners in Mountjoy were soon followed by prisoners in other camps, with about 8,000 men and women ultimately going on hunger strike. This huge number involved was in many ways at the root of the campaign's failure. There was a criticism within Republican quarters who felt the number of people on hunger strike was way too high, believing the numbers should be limited to carefully selected individuals, people who could be relied upon to follow the hunger strikes to the brutal end. Liam Pilkington believed it was hard to get a strike to succeed when there were a big number of men on strike. A hunger strike should consist of picked men only. The strike was poorly planned from the outset, with people unclear of its ultimate goal, when it could be called off, by whom, and on what grounds. Both the political and military leadership of the Republican movement was unaware of it before it started in Mountjoy, including De Valera. He was not asked to take part in the hunger strike. And here he is in the centre with Austin Stack to the right in Arbour Hill in early 1924. While people were allowed to participate or not in the hunger strike, many felt under pressure to take part, a sort of moral conscription. Peadar O'Donnell remarked that no one was ordered onto it, but then no one felt they could stay off it. He believed the decision to go on hunger strike was made when none of us knew we had a stomach. Now I have nothing else than a belly with needs that are ready to jump right through my mind. Despite pressure from public bodies, including ones that were Free State supporters, to release the prisoners and bring about peace, the government stood firm and would not yield to the hunger strikers, people who had not renounced violence against the Free State, people who had refused to accept its legitimacy. Within 3 weeks of the commencement of the hunger strike, many started to take food, which caused a domino effect, making it more and more difficult for others to stay on it. The strike was finally called off on 23rd of November, but it was too late for two men, Dennis Barry and Andy O'Sullivan, who died on the 20th and 22nd of November, respectively. Although the government released large numbers of prisoners and internees in November, the strike was ultimately a failure, with many remaining in prison until the summer of 1924. After years of seeking freedom, after it was finally achieved, the new state got off to the worst possible start. The Free State began with a terrible legacy of bitterness and divisiveness, spawning Civil War politics, which dominated domestic politics for decades. It took years for normality to return. Democracy did win out despite the brutality of the Civil War. It is important to note, though, that the Civil War was not a simplistic choice between pro-treaty Democrats and anti-treaty dictators. The war and its causes were never as clear-cut as either side pretended or came to believe. Unlike many other revolutions at the time, no military dictatorship took over. A vindication of this was the ease of transition of power just 9 years later, when the opposing side during the Civil War, under the guise of Fianna Fáil, took power in 1932. And even though the Free State remained a democracy, the power of the Catholic Church in many ways superseded the state, resulting in it being described as a non-military totalitarian church-state. Primarily because of the Civil War, the Irish Free State was impoverished economically at its inception. Army and compensation expenses for the Civil War absorbed almost 75% of tax revenue for the Free State alone in 1924. And here is, you can see a Mallow Viaduct being rebuilt in October 1923, after being destroyed in July 1922, severely curtailing train journeys from Dublin to Cork as a result. The government was in bad need of finances. This provided one reason why it decided to use its recently attained fiscal independence to impose customs barriers on 1st of April 1923 between the North and the South, in essence creating a land border on the island of Ireland. For many, the partition of Ireland only truly began with the establishment of the land border due to the arrival of customs barriers. Before then, partition was seen primarily as an administrative burden. With the creation of a physical border to approved and unapproved roads, customs huts, customs officers, checkpoints, forms and signs, partition became real and tangible. Fiscal autonomy was offered to Arthur Griffith, something he clearly cherished, and the Sinn Féin plenipotentiaries by British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, just hours before the Anglo-Irish Treaty was signed in the early hours of 6th of December 1921. While little attention has been paid to the financial clauses of the treaty, their impact was far-reaching. They allowed the Irish Free State to devise its own fiscal policies and tariffs separate from Northern Ireland and Britain. The provisional government of the Irish Free State, on the brink of civil war, asked the British government to act as agents of its revenue for the financial year 1922-23, before it pursued its own fiscal policies. It then created the new Department of Revenue Commissioners and sought help from the British to train its staff and to provide templates and manuals on how best to run its revenue department. As a key symbol of independence, the Irish Free State was determined to diverge from the British fiscal system at the earliest possible opportunity. Although aware of the implications such a decision could have on the border between the Free State and Northern Ireland, the Free State government felt it had no choice if Northern Ireland opted out of an Irish customs union, but to erect customs barriers along the 300-mile-long land frontier from Lough Carlingford to Lough Foyle. Presented with a choice of remaining within the UK fiscal system or joining an All-Ireland one, Ulster Unionists emphatically chose the former. The Northern Ireland Prime Minister, James Craig, was totally opposed to and asked the Free State government to cancel customs barriers for all time, stating the Free State would be responsible for partition and not Northern Ireland. On top of seeking fiscal independence from Britain and to generate revenue for the Exchequer, the policy was also an attempt to apply economic pressure on the nascent northern jurisdiction. The Free State-sponsored North Eastern Boundary Bureau claimed the erection of a customs barrier would gravely imperil the future prosperity of Northern Ireland and would extinguish the enormous distributing trade Belfast does with the rest of Ireland. Here's an almost full page, the Fermanagh Herald, devoted to those claims from the North Eastern Boundary Bureau. Like the naive and destructive Belfast boycott policy before it, many in the Free State believed the economic pressure caused by customs barriers would force the North to end partition. The decision to introduce customs barriers was announced in late February 1923, to be enacted just weeks later on 1st of April, leaving very little time for people and businesses to prepare. The arrangements were agreed between the Free State government and the British government, not the Northern administration, who had no control over customs and excise. In practical terms, the importing and exporting of merchandise across the border was prohibited, except through designated routes and at designated times. And here's a list of approved roads, customs stations and boundary posts. Customs stations were open for the clearance of merchandise between 9 AM and 5 PM daily, except on Sundays and public holidays. Farm produce was exempted initially, as was the removal of household furniture and small domestic supplies of non-dutiable goods. Cross-border roads were labelled as authorised concession or unauthorised unapproved. Every railway line crossing the border was approved for importation and exportation of merchandise. People wishing to move merchandise across the border had to submit a cargoes report to customs officials, where the actual goods were tracked against a documented amount and the relevant fees were then gathered. Although there was free movement of people due to the common travel area agreed between the British and Irish Free State governments earlier in 1923, those who crossed the border had their person and personal effects examined to prevent smuggling. There was widespread disapproval of the decision, north and south, particularly from those closest to the border. It was generally felt that the new customs barrier would lead to an increased cost of living for consumers, considerable confusion and lengthy delays in the handling of traffic. As 1st of April drew closer, the physical signs of the new measures began to appear. Declaration forms were issued at railway stations. Proclamations appeared in newspapers. Signs and posters displayed in prominent places. Construction began on customs huts and stations along the border, many of them temporary in nature initially. Staff were hired to man the new stations. Railway companies hired extra staff to meet the extra demands. And here's an image from the Times of London, showing a busy scene at Dublin docks in late March 1923, as many rushed to land goods into the Free State before the customs barriers were introduced the following week. Days after it was introduced on 1st of April, the real effects of the customs barrier began to be realised. The new arrangements led to an increased congestion at ports and border controls, with goods awaiting clearance, leading to heavy losses and disruption to businesses. It resulted in the closure of some border companies relying on cross-border trade. The customs barriers severely curtailed the movements of residents along the border. Railway services suffered considerable disruptions, with some lines zigzagging the border on numerous occasions, with customs examinations expected for each crossing. For example, a train running from Clonus to Cavan crossed the border 6 times in 8 miles. Common sense soon prevailed, and it was decided to curb the examinations to just the first point of entry beyond the border. The trade barriers introduced in 1923 had a negative impact on trade. In one high-profile example, Henry Ford cancelled a visit to Ireland in protest over tariffs and customs barriers, claiming he had hoped to build cars for all of Europe at his Cork factory, but moved his car-making operation to Manchester instead, due to the Irish Free State's trade barriers. The consequences of the new measures were most keenly felt by the border counties. Donegal economically cut off from Derry, Down and Armagh from Louth. One company close to the border, Dundalk Distillery, issued a notice to its 150 employees saying they no longer had jobs as the new customs barrier prevented them from selling their products in Northern Ireland and England. The once vibrant commercial town of Clonus in Monaghan slumped economically as shoppers stopped crossing the border from many places in Fermanagh and started shopping in places like Enniskillen instead. Some industries, such as tobacco and confectionery, saw immediate benefits from the protectionism offered by the customs barriers, with English companies such as Imperial Tobacco and Cadbury's subsequently building factories in Dublin to supply the Free State markets, hiring thousands of people in the process. The creation of the land border in 1923 undoubtedly added a high degree of permanency to partition. The physical machinery of the customs barriers helped to cement it. The introduction of the customs barrier made it tangible and real. This formalisation of the land border saw long-established economic and social ties drastically impeded. As such, it was that much easier for the Boundary Commission to retain the status quo in 1925. Achieving fiscal independence fiscal autonomy with the ability to impose customs barriers was an important symbol of nationhood the Free State government was willing to exploit as it started to navigate its way through its independence journey in 1923. Having fought so hard to achieve independence, the Free State government went to large efforts to have a status as a sovereign independent state recognised internationally. Becoming a member of the League of Nations in September 1923 was an important milestone on this journey, as was membership of other international bodies and being able to compete in the sporting arena as a nation. Of what was overall a very bleak year, just as 1923 was drawing to a close, in November 1923, the Free State received some welcome international news, with W.B. Yeats winning the Nobel Prize for Literature. And here is Yeats arriving in Stockholm for the Nobel Prize ceremony in December 1923. Yeats clearly won the award for his outstanding contribution to poetry. He was, however, happy to be identified with the Irish Free State and his position as a senator within it. And here is Yeats arriving at Leinster House in September 1923. On receiving the Nobel Prize, he said he thought the award was given to him not just for his own work, but as a part of Europe's welcome to the Free State, and I am very happy that it should be so. The following year, his brother Jack won the first Olympics medal for the Irish Free State, winning silver in the art competition at the 1924 Paris Olympics for his painting The Liffey Swim. The Paris Olympics was the first Olympic Games the Irish Free State competed in as a separate country. The International Olympic Committee, the IOC, ruling that the Irish Free State was entitled to do so in 1922. Irish people had competed in previous Olympic Games, the modern Games coming into being in 1896, primarily under the British umbrella, most notably at the London Olympic Games of 1908, where native-born Irishmen collected as many as 8 gold, 17 silver and 8 bronze medals in 15 different disciplines. Although representing Great Britain, the men's Irish hockey team did win a silver medal at the 1908 Olympic Games, competing as Ireland, losing to England in the final. 1924 was the first occasion Irish athletes could compete solely under the Irish banner, an important symbol of nationhood. As well as becoming a member of the League of Nations in 1923, the main soccer body in the Irish Free State, Football Association of Ireland, the FAI, became a member of the international governing body, FIFA, in 1923. Achieving international recognition allowed sports such as athletics and soccer to present a physical manifestation of the nation. Other nations were able to see Irish flags and jerseys and hear Irish national anthems for the first time at different sporting events. As my own research on football in Ireland has shown, the FAI was initially thwarted in its efforts to gain entry to FIFA. The international governing body was unclear of the Irish Free State status as a national entity and was reluctant to do anything that might upset the English FA, seen by many associations at the time as the primary authority in global soccer. The FAI sought and received the support of the Irish Free State government. The new government found it difficult to gain acceptance internationally. Thus, self-definition in areas such as sport became hugely important. The FIFA Annual Congress held in Geneva in 1923 was the first in 9 years, the First World War and its aftermath putting paid to a Congress before then. New members of FIFA could only be admitted at annual congresses. Many of the delegates from other countries asked questions about the Irish Free State's political status, its relations with Westminster, and the nature of the boundary between the 6 counties of Northern Ireland and the rest of Ireland. After a debate, FIFA agreed that the FAI would be granted membership if it restricted its membership to clubs in the 26 counties, which it subsequently did. The FAI also changed its name to the Football Association of the Irish Free State and was granted provisional membership status to FIFA in August 1923, becoming a full member in 1924. And here's a programme for a match in Dalymount Park in 1935 between Nazi Germany and an Irish team selected by the Football Association of the Irish Free State. The international body the Free State government was most keen to join was the League of Nations, doing so after a long process that involved complicated diplomacy. Its desire to join the League was primarily to demonstrate its independent voice in world affairs, one quite separate from Britain. It would offer a positive international image of the Irish Free State. It would show how the treaty gave the Free State full nationhood, and it would have the added effect of binding the British government to the treaty. Headquartered in Geneva in Switzerland, the League of Nations was created by the post-First World War Peace Conference in Versailles in 1919. Its mission was to ensure that there would not be such a deadly global conflict again. While the Free State made inquiries and joined the League in early 1922, it was not in a position to formally apply until it officially became into existence on 6th of December 1922, exactly a year after the treaty was signed. Approved by the Free State Executive Council in March 2023, the Minister for External Affairs, Desmond Fitzgerald, wrote to the League Secretary General, Sir Eric Drummond, on 17th of April, applying for membership, writing, "In accordance with the terms of the League of Nations, I have the honour to request that the Free State of Ireland may be admitted as a member of the League of Nations, and that this request may be placed on the agenda of the next meeting of the Assembly of the League." After dealing with issues relating to the size of the Free State military and the Irish Senate's query on the Executive Council powers, on the Executive Council's powers to apply for membership without approval from the Oireachtas, the Irish Free State was able to join the League of Nations in September 1923. Led by Cosgrave, a high-profile Irish delegation went to Geneva, where the Irish Free State was unanimously voted in as a member at the Assembly of the League of Nations on 10th of September 1923. Here is the 1923 Assembly in session. Addressing the gathering, Cosgrave promised that the Irish Free State resolved to play our part in making this great institution for peace as complete and efficient as possible. The Irish Free State's membership of the League of Nations was enthusiastically welcomed by the public. Here's a large crowd gathered outside the Metropole restaurant on O'Connell Street to greet Cosgrave shortly after his return from Geneva, there to congratulate him on the Irish Free State taking an important step on being recognised as a nation of the world. That concludes today. So next week I will start to delve deeper into each of the topics discussed tonight, with a focus on the Civil War in 1923, the final months. And from next week as well, at the end of each lecture, I'll provide a further reading list of books that related to each topic. So thank you for your time. If you have any questions or comments, I'll be very happy to take them for you now.